Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Earth Day Everyday podcast, where we aim to spotlight exemplary activists, policymakers, and changemakers in the field of sustainability and climate change. I'm your host, Aryan Doshi, and today we are extremely fortunate to have Dr. Myrivili with us. Dr. Myrivili is the UN Chief Heat Officer, former Deputy Mayor of Athens for Urban Nature, and Senior Advisor at the Arched Rock Resilience Center. Dr. Myrivili, it is an absolute honor and privilege to have you with us today.
It's an honor for me to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So, yeah, just to get us started, first, as someone who has worked so closely with climate policy in Athens, Greece, right? You championed urban resilience and advocated about global warming. Can you talk about the impact and effects you've seen firsthand due to climate change? And can you maybe describe that journey and that sense of realization for you that this was the field that you wanted to join and really make an impact in Athens in Greece?
Thanks. Thanks, Ariane. This is it's kind of a good question because um I was always worried about climate change. Not always,
Yeah,
since well, we've probably I don't know how when you were born, but around 2009
yeah,
I started kind of really getting particularly worried because it was a period with extreme wildfires all around Greece where I lived. I was living at the time,
yeah,
and I felt we were really not prepared for it, and there was no directions to the people as to what to do, et cetera, et cetera. So then that's how I started getting involved in politics in a way.
yeah,
And I ended up deciding to run for city government in 2014
yeah,
um, because I kind of realized I got like a real um, desire to get engaged and
yeah.
start working with cities because I read this amazing book that was called If Mayors Ruled the World.
Wow.
And it was really an incredible book because I kind of realized how cities are really close to the problem and close to the people, and really kind of mayors don't have to deal with tons of
Yeah,
weird stuff that people in party politics have to deal with in a way. But anyway, so then when I was in the city of Athens, I started working to create this resilience strategy, as you said, for the city of Athens. And I realized that the city was doing nothing about climate change. Like they were doing a lot of other things to make, to do things that had to
yeah,
do with social welfare and, whatever,
yeah,
commerce and development, but they didn't really do much about climate. And that's true about a lot of cities, like especially in relation to building resilience and adapting to
yeah,
climate change. Cities started kind of thinking about this relatively late, like in the
yeah,
last 5 or so years. Like they were starting already to deal with mitigation and how can we, like it was much more discussed anyway,
yeah,
like how
yeah,
can we, yeah, like mitigate
absolutely.
GHG emissions, but not much about how do we adapt and all that.
Yeah,
And then in Athens, people were already talking about heat and
mm,
extreme heat, and they were a
yeah,
little worried about heat waves and all that. That's now in 2016,
wow,
17.
yeah,
And the politicians were totally like not,
yeah,
totally did not have it in their discourse at all, like
yeah,
the whole thing at
wow,
all. Like climate change is much less discussed in Greece than it is in the US, and it's much less part of the social discourse and political
yeah,
discourse.
yeah,
And anyway, nobody was talking about resilience and nobody was talking about heat. And then because I was in this network of 100 cities from around the world, from like New York to Ramallah to,
mm,
Indian cities to
yeah,
Australia, like all over the world,
yeah,
100 resilient cities that run the same methodology. I also realized that very few cities were paying a lot of attention to heat. Like
yeah,
there was a lot of discussion about flooding and hurricanes and other kind of problems, but people were not talking about heat. And the planet was heating up and nobody was talking about heat. So it was kind of like, guys, we have to deal with this.
yeah,
And and so that's how I started really kind of putting all of my efforts. I decided
yeah,
after my term was finished in the city of Athens to start working with the Arched Rock Resilience Center, and I went for a fellowship. And like at the end of the fellowship, I was kind of certain that this was what I should be doing. So and then I became the chief heat officer of Athens, and then eventually the global chief heat officer for the
Yeah.
UN Habitat. And basically, as this thing was happening, at the same time, heat waves started becoming much more intense, much more frequent,
Yeah.
with much higher temperatures,
For
and
sure.
they started kind of happening all around the world in extraordinary, like kind of extraordinarily. And
Yeah.
so more and more people started being interested and
For
started
sure.
talking about it. And again, cities were to a large extent in the forefront,
Yeah.
preparing, putting policies
Absolutely.
and all that. So
Yeah.
that's how the whole thing kind of evolved.
Yeah. And can you maybe talk about what goes on behind the scenes in policy making, right? Because oftentimes people who are not a part of the government, they don't see how is it that we form these crucial decisions to address global warming and climate change, and working with other officials to establish those measures, whether it be infrastructure, buildings, creating green spaces. So can you talk about what really goes on to implement those measures in cities and in society?
That's such a great question. So it depends. Sometimes, so it always has to do, strangely enough, I did not realize how important the mayor is,
Yeah.
or, the person at the head, at the
Mhm.
helm. Like, it really is extraordinarily important who we put at the
Absolutely.
head of our institutions and of our governments, because ultimately, to a very large extent, it comes down to whether he or she thinks that this is what they want to
Yeah.
do, whether it's okay or not.
Mhm.
So if it's not one of the priorities of
Mm.
the leader to
Yeah.
actually do something, then how do you do it? So
Yeah.
you have to create constituencies. You have to figure out who are the people and which are the groups
Yeah.
that care about this issue,
Yeah.
and start discussing with them and bring them into the fold and ask them what do they need and what kind of policies and what kind of things do they actually think are important. And the
Yeah.
wider types of stakeholders you bring onto this, the better it is,
For sure.
because then they help you. Ideally, we're talking ideally now, right?
Yeah.
They help you co-design something,
Yeah.
which then comes to the mayor or comes to the deputy mayor first and then eventually to the mayor. Passes through, often it passes through city council and it
Mhm.
gets voted on. But
Yeah.
the wider the spectrum of different stakeholders that you
Mhm.
can get on your side, and of course the bigger the number. But let's
Yeah.
say you don't have time to get tons of people, but if at least you could get some people from the private sector
Yeah.
that kind of come in and help with the writing, and some
Mm.
people from definitely some people from scientists
For
that
sure.
can give you data that say this is like you have to do something in this neighborhood because
Yeah.
this neighborhood is much hotter than the other one, and this is the measurements that we have, and these are the maps. So you
Yeah.
have to get that, and then you have to get some representatives of the vulnerable communities,
Yeah.
often people that don't have much of a voice, and then you have to get maybe some other levels of government that
Sure.
might
Yeah.
kind of have done something. And
Fine.
so you get all together. Ideally, you write something
Yeah.
all together, or at least you write stuff and then you ask them to add or comment on, and
Yeah.
then you take that to the next level, either
Fine.
to the deputy mayor or to the city
Yeah.
government, and then it's voted, and then you go to the mayor and say, Mayor, this is like, we need to do this, and look
Yeah.
at all these people that are kind of
Absolutely.
really asking you to do this. So usually this is the best way, but
Mm.
sometimes it's not like that. Sometimes it's because somebody gives you money to do something.
Yeah.
So you kind of some like a, a bank or
Yeah.
a private sector decides that they want to plant trees, as you
Yeah.
said, and they want to give you money to plant trees. So then it becomes kind of weird because suddenly they give you a lot of money and they want you to plant a
Yeah.
lot of trees,
Yeah.
and you're not ready to
Yeah.
plant all these trees, and you have
For
to
sure.
figure
Yeah.
out and create the capacity and figure out how to do it. So that's kind of the other way around.
Yeah.
Then then there is then of course there is, the mayor decides that this is a priority for some reason, and then you have also to then you have to go to the department that in the municipality that usually takes care of designing, because often in the municipality you have like different departments that design
Yeah,
policies. Then I created the Department of Resilience and
wow,
Sustainability in the
yeah,
municipality of Athens. So they would, if the mayor said, I want blah blah blah, like I want you to figure out um, how we can create water
yeah,
redundancies in
for sure.
Athens so that our water system or how to put public fountains and
Yeah,
where to put them. So, then we have to figure out how to design what would the fountain look like, what
yeah,
would it cost, where should it go. So these are different
yeah.
ways of doing this, at least in on the level of the
Yeah.
municipality.
Yeah, and I think like what you were saying, it's essentially like we're uniting people from all levels of government to really create a movement when you pass the legislation. And then once you pass it, you're able to see the change that you want to see in society. But can you also talk about when you're designing sustainable spaces in the city, what are some options that you go to when like you look at a city that's suffering from pollution, greenhouse gases, doesn't have a good environmental friendly index score? What are your sort of ideas to fix that city and really implement some environmental solutions? Is it like adding a public water fountain, like you said, like planting more trees, or just how do you sort of plan around that in transforming that city from where it is right now at its current state to where you want it to be?
So I think what you do is you first create a vision.
Yeah.
And again, you get as many people to buy into that vision as possible.
Sure.
And then you break down the vision to kind of smaller um, um, ideas or
Yeah.
smaller kind of buckets
Yeah.
of ideas. And then those kind of buckets of ideas get broken down to more concrete actions, which would be, some of them could be tiny, some of them could be bigger, but they all kind of fit in the bucket, which
Yeah.
then fit the vision. So when I am thinking of, for example, when because I'm focusing on heat,
Yeah.
and I think of sustainable cities as cities that are cooler.
Yeah.
I First and foremost, I mean, there's tons of other things
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
can make our cities more sustainable, but for me, I kind of put in the forefront heat, and then I think that the rest of the stuff can be actually addressed if you look at a heat as like the
Yeah.
spearhead of
Yeah.
creating, for example, sustainability or
Yeah.
resilience. So I always think in these three buckets: awareness raising, preparedness, which is like how can I make sure to protect the populations
Yeah.
during the incident, and then redesign, which is basically, I think, your question, which is how do you redesign a
Yeah.
city
Yeah.
so that it is ready for the future,
Mhm.
basically, and it's livable in a couple of decades.
Yeah.
And for me, it seems rather clear that um, if we create much more nature positive cities, which means if we really radically change the percentage of green and blue spaces in
Yeah.
our cities, um, and minimize cars and
Mhm.
minimize the space that in our cities, the public space in our cities that we dedicate to cars,
Mhm.
then the more we can create cities that are more livable and more
Yeah.
sustainable. And you can choose which areas you can transform in a city. You don't have to do that, for the whole city, but you can create like areas where you actually do this and then connect them and
Really.
make kind
Yeah.
of like a network
Yeah.
of kind of greener neighborhoods which can actually make a very big difference for the whole city.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking of American cities, and a lot of American cities are spread out,
For sure.
and they're based on, the idea of the car, which is
Yeah.
very problematic for
Yeah.
our climate era. And even if we all change our cars to EV cars, it's still a problematic thing because our cities are really spread out and we need density and we need to create again. Well, the good thing about American cities is that there's plenty of space to create green cities if you
Yeah.
give less space to the cars.
Yeah.
So ideally, it could be that our cities end up having much more sustainable mobility, which means what we call slow mobility. So people use cars a little bit less, hopefully, and they have more density to
Yeah.
them. And at the same time, they have much more density of green and blue infrastructure.
Yeah.
And then you basically have to break down what are your critical systems in a city. You have to see, okay, water is a critical system. How can I make sure that I have water for the next decades? What are, the economics of water
Yeah.
in my city? What are the backups that I can bring in? What other kind of systems can I make sure that I throw into the mix?
Yeah.
Another critical system is, energy.
Yeah.
How can I kind of, again, make my energy system more sustainable, more resilient,
Yeah.
etc. Another one is food. How can I make food security? And so
Absolutely.
then you go through your critical
Yeah.
systems. But I think you kind of start from public space and transportation
Yes,
and
and you
nature,
branch out. Yeah.
and then you kind of think of all of the other stuff.
Yeah. And I know you were mentioning like talking about removing more parking spaces and then we can use that space instead as placeholder for sustainable infrastructure. But how do you sort of change that sentiment around cars and around fossil fuels? Because I know in Greece and in the United States, like a huge part of the energy sector does come from fossil fuels. And
Yeah.
fossil fuels, like they're not only powering the cars, it's also a huge source of profit for numerous countries, corporations around the world, which is why they're so hesitant to leave it behind and really alleviate the problem that and damage that cars are producing. And so do you sort of envision us being able to transition from fossil fuels to maybe some cleaner energy so that then we can remove those unnecessary car spaces and maybe use more public transit or more friendly forms of transportation to then use that remaining space for sustainable infrastructure?
I really believe that it's possible to move away from fossil fuels. I think that part of the reason, we still have fossil fuels is because there's a lot of subsidies
Yeah,
for fossil fuels and a lot of, as you said, powerful economies that still
yeah,
depend on them and are not willing to change
yeah,
their ways. But I think it's possible to move away and we have to. Basically, it's not even
yeah,
possible. We have to do it. So it's not even a question in my mind. And I am angry and I'm pissed off and I'm really worried
yeah,
about the when is we seem to be sleepwalking
mm,
into a climate that is unlivable and I don't understand what it will take to really kind of get people to move faster
yeah,
into phasing out fossil fuels altogether.
yeah,
And it's I know that a lot of us are a lot of cities, a lot of different kind of community groups, a lot of NGOs, a lot of even a lot of politicians. Some politicians are really really struggling, and every time it just takes more and more energy, and it never kind of becomes kind of more obvious. And the funding that we spent for climate change globally. I
yeah,
know like some data, like for 2022,
yeah,
the world spent globally
yeah.
1.2 approximately $1 trillion on climate change.
Oh,
Now, about 1.2 trillion, about 1 trillion went to mitigation, which means fossil fuel, like
yeah,
moving away from fossil
yeah,
fuel.
yeah,
Only a few 100 million
yeah,
billion,
billion.
this is crazy,
Yeah,
like few billion went to adaptation and resilience. But this is one thing. Like one problem is that we have to put more funding into adaptation and resilience.
yeah,
But just the pure amount of 1.3 trillion for
Mm.
climate investments is tiny,
Yeah.
tiny. I would just let you know that for 2020,
Mm.
globally, for supporting, fiscal problems in different countries all around the world
Yeah.
because of COVID,
Yeah.
we spent 11.7 trillion in 1 year.
Wow. Yeah.
And for climate change, which is like such an incredible thing that is threatening life on the planet as it is, like
Mm.
in the next couple of decades, we spent one.
Yeah.
I mean, it's insane. They're
Mm.
saying that in order to keep our temperatures close to 1.5,
Mm.
we have to spend around 9 trillion a year.
Yeah.
And we're doing until 2030, and
Yeah.
we're just doing one. So this is just to show you, like, of course it's possible
Yeah.
to move away from fossil fuels, but we need to take it much more serious and invest and mobilize assets and mobilize funding and bring the private sector and give incentives and do like tons of stuff as if we are in an emergency like
Yeah.
we were during COVID, and we're
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. And I think what people don't understand, like what you're saying there, is when they view the problem of climate, I just don't think they take it with a sense of seriousness and gravity, as some of the other issues. Like I was listening to someone talking the other day about when we think about climate today, the first thing we have to do is panic, really, because only once we panic will we invoke this sense of urgency and allow really everyone to unite in this movement and come together. Because like you're saying, just looking at those two numbers, there's just such a stark comparison between one problem and the climate problem, and the lack of funding there. But when we're
So
talking about building sustainable cities as well, I know one of your other main focuses is addressing biodiversity. And when we talk about moving from, let's say, an agricultural space to maybe a more urban space, we always have to think about the species that might not have homes anymore, or the species that have to move from one place to another place through migration, or even if it's just small sort of changes to a city that can affect how animals move about from place to place. And so how do you sort of ensure that, both plants and animals, they're able to adapt to the changes that officials are implementing, and that biodiversity loss isn't as problematic as it is in so many places?
So biodiversity loss is a very, very big issue, and
Yeah.
it's very much linked to climate change. And I'm glad you're bringing it up because it's very much related.
Yeah.
Um, Cities, even though a lot of people don't realize, do have biodiversity. Of course, not as much as you can
Sure.
find in a forest or in, and other parts of our world.
Yeah.
But cities do have biodiversity that we have to support, and we have to make sure that, we have to take care of their well-being, because when the cities have more biodiversity and healthy ecosystems, that's when the cities are healthier themselves. Like people are healthier. People have, we know there's like tons of reports out there that tell you that, you know, people that live in cities with more nature and
Yeah.
more biodiversity are happier and mentally healthier and
Yeah.
physically healthier
Yeah.
people. So part of what people are doing with the way they design cities now, when we're talking about more nature positive cities, is that to create always, whenever you create a park or whenever you create any other kind of blue or green infrastructure or nature-based solution or all of these things, create connections, like make
Yeah.
some kind of green corridor or some kind of, little connection between, like with a little river, or,
Yeah.
in some way connect all of the existing green areas so that the animals can
Move.
actually
Yeah.
move from
From
one
one
to
place. Yeah.
another and not be isolated in these urban islands,
Yeah.
where eventually this could be kind of much, much less possible for them to survive, or
Yeah.
it's, there's like less ecosystemic richness there.
Yeah.
So that's important. But can I say that also, whether it has to do with climate change or with biodiversity, I want to come back to the point that I started with talking to you, Ariane, which is that we have to be very careful who we vote for.
Yeah.
And we have to to be very, very careful that we check what our leaders on every level of government, but especially now that you guys in the States have a really significant um, election coming up, uh, who are the people that are supporting climate policies and biodiversity policies, because whether the US is going to do whatever it's going to do in relation to these issues, it's going to affect the whole world because you're a
Absolutely.
large economy. And whether you kind of decide, like last time with when you had the previous Trump presidency, when he moved out of the Paris agreements
Yeah.
and started kind of backpedaling tons of really important climate,
Yeah.
biodiversity, and environmental um, uh,
For,
legislation that was really important for the United States.
mm,
We don't have I mean, not the United States, but the whole world, we don't have the luxury to
mm,
play with these things. We
yeah.
have to do things now, and we don't have time to just, you know,
Yeah.
uh, try things out and
Yeah.
have like a couple more politicians at the helm that are clueless about these
Yeah.
issues.
And I think it's interesting you also bring that up, right? Because so many of the politicians we see in the global north, aside from there are a few countries who are very supportive in establishing climate legislation, but so much of the emission does come from the global north and from Western countries. And yet, so much of the effect goes on the global south, who is only producing like 1% of the emissions as well. So
Exactly.
it's like
Exactly.
it's like the balance that we're dealing with, it's completely skewed, and it's skewed in a way that isn't really proportionate or fair to so many groups who did nothing to contribute but are now facing the brunt of the issue as well. So I think that
There's
is such
great
a
in, you're absolutely right. The issue of inequity in relation to the impacts of climate change is enormous. And it's not only um, it's the biggest is what you're saying, like between the
mm,
global north and the global south. You're absolutely right. But even, in the global north, in cities, the people that actually are the people that um, consume the less,
mm,
the smallest part, or often, of their share of fossil fuels, or of all of the other things that contribute to, are often, the people that bear the brunt the
yeah.
most.
And can you also
That's not
talk about
always the case. That's not always the case,
yeah, yeah.
but that's
Mhm.
enough of times the case that we have to look at that.
Yeah, for sure. And when we're talking about in the global north, right? I know you were talking about some countries like the United States, in many ways, they're digressing from supporting climate legislations and being a part of the Paris Agreement. Can you also talk about there are some countries like a lot of the Scandinavian countries, a lot
Mm.
of countries in Europe that are doing incredible things to sort of support us as we transition to this climate movement. Like I know in the Netherlands, for example, they have bike highways. So it's one of the most friendly cities in the world, no cars. And like you were saying, there's this sense of interconnectedness, right? You can get from anywhere you want to go to just by using a bike. And so can you maybe talk about what is it that we have to learn from many of these Scandinavian countries and what they're doing? Because you were talking about it earlier as well about sustainable infrastructure being correlated to depression rates and being more happy. And we see in Finland as well. I mean, they're one of reportedly the happiest cities in the world, and they have amazing sustainable infrastructure that allows people to get from place to place. So, what is
And
it?
Vienna too, in
Yeah.
Austria as well, which all of these cities have kind of gone through a transformation during the last 10 or 20 years of the things that I've been talking about. And this is why I think it's possible to do
Yeah.
them. Yeah, and it's to a large extent an issue of political will, and an issue of some kind of people that are in power that have foresight and that look to the future and that do things that actually are not just for now. You know, it's weird because often the people that we elect, they have 4 years or 5 years or
Yeah,
whatever
yeah.
years that they're in power, and you know they want to show uh, they sh- they
How
want to
much they
show
can do.
yeah, that they've accomplished things, and it has to be different. We have to really value people that look to the future and they do things that have a long-term impact and a long-term maturation.
Mhm.
For example, with trees again, right? When you plant a tree, it takes at least, 30 years, depending on the tree, to have the full impact, the full positive kind of services, let's say, that the tree gives back to the city.
Mhm.
And often, the way that, for example, mayors budget things, they budget, for planting the tree, but you actually have to budget for planting the tree, but also for maintaining the tree,
Absolutely.
like making sure that, you will support it and you will um, uh,
Nurture. Yeah.
nurture it. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
And find people that will be its patrons, let's say, and make sure that there's a longer life for it. And I'm saying that because trees are having a harder and harder times to survive
Yeah.
in our cities. They're
Deforestation.
more and more stressed because of extreme heat, because of pollution, as you said, because of, all of the hard surfaces and the lack of, permeability
Yeah.
that allows water to go in, and et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know if I answered to your question.
Yeah, yeah, no, you did, yeah, about sustainable cities. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And when we're talking sort of about actions like planting trees, like maybe using less fossil fuels, like a common mindset we see is like, how am I as one person gonna have any difference if I just plant one tree? Like it takes so long to grow. And so how is it gonna make any difference in the long run, right? And so like from your experience, how do we change that mindset and that narrative, because it starts off with one person, but then like you were saying, you collaborate with more people, connect with more people, one person becomes many, expands to many. And so if it's not just you planting one tree, but you spread the word and now you have 10 people, then like 20 people, and you sort of expand it out, then it's not just your contribution, but it's many. So what advice do you have to change that mindset?
My advice is for people to join, community groups or,
Yeah.
whatever kind of groups, and go into local government. Like try to influence local governments and local decisions on any kind of level where they can participate and they can vote and they can vie for positions. Like I think that we have turned our backs because we don't kind of trust
Yeah.
government and public institutions. And
Mm.
instead we have to turn around and really, like, instead of seeing ourselves as doing being part of, the global community by doing things like, recycling or, doing things on our private. We always used to say the what is it? The personal is the political. I mean, that's part. I mean, we apart. That's part of it. But I
Mm.
think more importantly now is to turn towards our democratic institutions and participate in them much more strongly. So we take the institutions by storm, and we
Awesome.
actually make decisions that affect more people and more constituencies that help them survive and thrive in the future. And that's my thing. I think people should go into politics more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think once you're able to sort of get in the field of policy and work with government officials, once you see
It's
the impact that it's having, then it sort of motivates you more
Yes,
to
yes.
keep on working and to keep on passing legislation.
Absolutely. I was like, it really opened my eyes to a reality that I had no idea about
Yeah.
when I decided to run for local government. I
Yeah.
was a professor at the university and I said, this is crazy. I have to do something. And I did. And
Wow.
I learned so much and my life became so much intense and so much more interesting.
Yeah.
And, but also you, you, I mean, also you, Ariane, you kind of decided to create a blog, right? Which
Yeah,
is like, it's kind of participating in the political sphere. It's
yeah,
like you do
absolutely.
beyond, you stop kind of being a single individual that does the best that they
Yeah,
can do in their private space. You try to kind of influence the public sphere, and that I think means getting involved in public policy
absolutely.
in many different ways.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think I've learned so much from this conversation as well in terms of if we want to sort of broaden our outreach, broaden our scope, right, then policy and politics will be the way to go. And once you keep on establishing legislation, seeing the impact, then like you want to do more. And then once you see the impact it has on people, like it's not just the legislation, right? But underneath that, you see the real life impact it has on the people of the
That's
city that
true.
you're living with, then
That's
that's
very true.
another sort of source of motivation. No, but thank you
That's
so
very
much.
true.
Yeah, thank you
Thank
so much.
you.
Yeah. I guess just one last question here, just to wrap up is for like the aspiring environmentalists today, right? When they sort of enter the field, it can be hard to find out like where to start, right? Because the field is so broad and so many people are spewing out different ideas, different thoughts about the issue. And so what do you sort of say to someone who wants to sort of enter the field of environmental science, maybe work in the urban sector, but they don't know where to start? They don't know how to get sort of involved with local government and policy. Like, what advice do you have to them to just get started so that someday they can make the impact that you've had in your city? And so what sort of advice do you have for that?
I think that maybe one way to start might be to start looking what the city is doing in the field that is of your interest. Start reading what they put out, start seeing, stuff that they put in the social media, like start looking at the channels that, an institution that you're interested in. Let's say, your local EPA office. Do they have local offices? I
Yeah,
suppose they
yeah,
do.
yeah, yeah,
Or your your city thing, or even your library, your school, your whatever, like in the field that you care for, what are the different decisions that they're taking, the different information, the different knowledge that they're putting out,
yeah,
and start kind of engaging with them on what they are already doing,
yeah,
and try to kind of add something to what they're doing already and bring another perspective, or bring some other things, and try to kind of engage with them on the level where they're at, and try to get them to see you as value added to what they're doing.
yeah, absolutely. No, thank you so much, Dr. Myrivili, for sharing all your insights and
I
the
I'm
years of experience you have. And yeah, thank you.
thank you, and it was really a pleasure to
Yeah.
talk with you. Thanks for reaching out to
As
me.
well. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to all our viewers, all our audience. Thank you so much, Dr. Mirivili. And we'll see you all on the next episode of Earth Day Every Day. Thank you so much, everyone.